Good morning, everyone. Welcome to day 2 of what we have dubbed Soil and Water Management Week, dealing with dry conditions. So again, we have our same 4 people involved today. Myself, Curtis Cavers, you can see on screen, as well as Kim Brown-Livingston and John Hurd are acting as panelists. This morning, we are focusing on tillage and managing eroded landscapes. And so if you have questions regarding dealing with tillage decisions, dealing with erosion management, dealing with all of that and how that fits into the dry soil kind of issue and situation that we're in right now, today is the day to ask them. So Curtis is going to be presenting to us this morning. And again, if you have questions, and I will post this in the chat, please put them into the question box and we will answer them at the end of the presentation. Thank you very much and welcome here, Curtis.
Good morning, thank you, and welcome to Tillage Tuesday, as we called it. We'll try and go through a few principles today on tillage and eroded landscapes, but it doesn't have to be totally limited to that. We will start with that. I've only got a few slides to kind of hit on some high points here, and then we'll go to chat and questions, and of course my fellow panelists will jump in at any point if I start to drift off topic or if they got something that's pertinent to add there. So we want to talk a bit about erosion dynamics. So erosion can be wind erosion, water erosion, or tillage erosion. And of course, the reason we're talking about it right now is because these impacts, just like salinity, are expressed more in a dry year. And we're at a much greater risk of erosion when soils are dry and when there's a lack of soil cover. So the area that's usually most effective are these areas that are typically the dry part of the landscape anyway. So we're usually looking at these eroded hilltops that have the highest elevation and have convex slopes. So those are the areas where runoff is much more likely to happen than infiltration. And those are the reasons why these areas tend to be arid and tend to be prone to erosion and tend to be the less productive areas of the field. We want to look at why erosion is a problem. Largely, it's the removal of topsoil, and more specifically, it's the loss of soil organic matter. And that's the part that helps store soil moisture. So a loss of topsoil and a loss of soil organic matter means reduced water storage capacity. It can mean degraded seedbed properties. So it's a very difficult area to get seeds to germinate in without that topsoil. And of course, reduced cation exchange capacity, which means lack of ability or less ability to hold nutrients, and results in a overall less fertile soil because of our lack of ability to hold these cations. Our overall goal then on trying to improve productivity on these eroded knolls is to reduce the runoff and erosion potential, and then ultimately try and increase the infiltration of water. That's the overall goal. Get the water moving into the soil rather than moving off the soil, because water moving into that soil is going to obviously give you more soil moisture stored and available to produce crops. More crops mean more biomass, meaning more organic matter, and helps the soil that way. And of course, it helps build soils as well. Getting water moving into the soil is kind of the primary driver of how soils form. So we want to try and do that, and we'll talk a bit more about how to make that concept happen. But increase infiltration by reducing runoff is the big one. We want to increase soil organic matter any way possible. The reason for that is the rule of thumb that you see at the bottom of the screen there is a quick and dirty approximation there. A 1% increase in soil organic matter can increase crop yields by about 36%, which is a pretty big one, but it also comes with its challenges. It sounds like a small number, but it takes a lot of work and a lot of effort to raise your soil organic matter by 1%. So we'll talk about that a bit at some point here too. The big one here, and I'm not here to make anybody mad today or necessarily debate philosophies or anything like that, but tillage is often looked at as a very good thing for those that usually like to do it and like to do a lot of it. or it could be looked at as a very bad thing because of some of the negative connotations that can happen with inappropriate tillage or too much tillage or tillage at the wrong time and things like that. So we'll try and take a balanced approach to this and talk about whether tillage is a good thing or a bad thing. The benefits of tillage, why most people do it, is because you want to try and break up or bury the crop residues. We want to try and prepare a suitable seed bed, especially in the springtime, and as has been done for a long time, has been using tillage to control weeds. So those are good reasons to do it. The thing you want to still ask yourself, are these still relevant reasons with the type of seeders that we now have, with the herbicides that we have, but then we've got some herbicide resistance showing up, and that's going to lead into what Kim's going to talk about either later today and certainly tomorrow. So there's things there to ask yourself. There's good things about tillage. Do we still need to do them? Because some of the bad things about tillage is that, well, based on stirring up and enhancing evaporation on your soil, tillage can remove about a ½ inch of water per pass. And when conditions are warm and windy like they're supposed to be today, that could be high, just as high or higher than that. It reduces your soil residue cover. So our rules of thumb there is that you want to have at least 35% residue cover, ideally at all times on your soils. And if these soils are highly erodible, the rule of thumb is 65% or higher residue cover. Tillage oxidizes soil organic matter, and that causes it to break down over time. So while we're trying to build it, tillage is going to be basically tearing it down. We want to try and balance that out if we need to use tillage. And of course, the one that myself and some others are interested in these days is that tillage can redistribute topsoil, which is the phenomenon known as tillage erosion. It's the dragging of soil, particularly from higher areas in the landscape to lower areas in the landscape, especially with tillage equipment that uses high speeds, which we have a lot of now. It's especially bad if you're traveling down slope, if you're going up and down the hills rather than following the contours. And it's bad with equipment that tends to throw the soil. So it's not just the dragging, it's the throwing of it and having this move downhill. And we'll get into that later if there's interest. So if we're trying to manage eroded soils, what can we do? There's certain things that we can do, and hopefully by talking about them today, we can help people formulate a strategy. There's no one size fits all, so I'm not here to promote like a recipe necessarily, but there's things to consider, and we want people to at least consider doing tillage differently. So that could mean reducing your tillage speed or changing the direction, and if possible, if you've thought about it and considered the options, maybe even eliminating it if it's not deemed necessary. You can add and redistribute your crop residues to increase cover and conserve moisture. Rule of thumb there, though, is flat residue or residue that's been deposited or added is not as effective as standing stubble. And generally, the taller the stubble, the better it is at trapping and conserving moisture. And given that we're in a dry situation that Marla described yesterday with the tank being essentially empty, or at least on the lower side of full, less than half full in a lot of places, we shouldn't be worried about, if we're trying to conserve moisture, that we're going to make soils too wet. We probably run into that other years where we've talked about conserving moisture on certain parts of the field, and there may be some resistance because, well, if I do that on the whole field, my low areas are going to be too wet and I won't be able to get in there in the spring. But this year, given how dry it is, I don't think that's going to be a major issue. We can add manures, particularly solid manures, where they're needed most, and this has been done in the past with the livestock folks directed as bale grazing, trying to feed and put the manure in areas of the field like the eroded knolls where it's needed the most. Cover crops, I'm sure that may come up as something that's an important thing to have, whether they're intentional or volunteer crops or weeds. Those may be things to look at, and trying to establish intentional cover crops when it's dry like this may not be an easy thing or a desirable thing if we're trying to conserve moisture. So we can look at that. Adding fertilizer, I think that came up yesterday, or water are ways to somehow improve your soil organic matter or your overall soil health, but those are very expensive ways to do right now. So the one that myself and others are looking at and have looked at in the past is, if you're trying to increase your soil organic matter in these eroded areas quickly, one way might be to move topsoil from lower positions in the landscape to these other areas, especially if it's been dragged off the hilltops downslope by tillage erosion. If we theoretically put it back where it was originally, hopefully that's a very effective and quick way to reestablish productivity in eroded areas. And this is kind of a schematic of doing that. So take a run at this just so you understand my shorthand on things like this. LR is landscape restoration. So it's the practice of moving topsoil from these low areas where, if you remember our soil talks that I give all over time when I stand in the pit and spew stuff about soils, W is code for soils with a wetness limitation. So your lower lying areas here, they tend to be very thick with topsoil. And if we can transfer some of that from here, even up this far upslope, up to these areas here where you've got soils that are eroded and have a moisture limitation, the theory behind that is, if you keep, especially too, if you're keeping this in no-till and eliminating any future tillage, the idea is that you should have a maximum and a much bigger long-term benefit than any kind of detriment that you've caused down here. So hopefully that the economics and the overall productivity balance so that this is a feasible thing to do. Working on trying to prove that right now, or confirm what previous work has shown in other areas like South Dakota, Minnesota, and other parts of Manitoba. So I've got other stuff we can bring up and try and refer to if need be, but that was kind of the run I was going to take at getting things going here. Most of the work that I've referred to here is stuff that's in the soil management guide, and I've got an old version, but there's newer versions of this hard copy and online, and if we need to go through some of that, that would be great. From there, I think I'll turn it over back to Marla, and we'll open it up for discussion.
Yeah, I love that you talk about it being the new version. It's a newer version. It's still from 2008, so it definitely still needs some updating. And one of these days, maybe I'll get around to doing that. But yeah. So again, if anybody has questions, feel free to pop this in. We're already getting comment in here saying, excellent presentation, Curtis. Thanks for covering that. One thing that I wanted to bring up or ask about, and we can kind of chat about a little bit, is the idea that for that erosion, so there's older work that's been done looking at stripping topsoil, right, off of the surface of the soil and looking at whether or not you can apply fertilizer to make up for the lost nutrients that are coming from that loss of organic matter, essentially, and the loss of that surface soil. And anybody who has gone to any of our soil fertility clinics or some of the soil and water presentations that we've given when we're talking about this has probably seen these old slides. But there's two different soil types that they were doing this with. One was a clay loam and the other one was a fine sandy loam, I think. And the big take-home message that really ties back to what we're dealing with right now in dry conditions is that on the clay loam, that soil, you could add fertilizer, and even though we had stripped 8 inches of topsoil, you could still add potentially fertilizer back to make up for that loss of nutrient that's gone with the organic matter. But on the sandy loam, or the loamy fine sand, whatever it was a sandier soil, lighter soil, you can take off that 8 inches of topsoil, and it didn't matter how much fertilizer essentially is being thrown at it, you can't bring back the water holding capacity that was lost with that organic matter, essentially. So the clay loam is going to hold some of that water for you just based on those inherent soil properties that the clay will have. But when you don't have that clay content in your soil, you're really losing out when you have that type of erosion, and that's going to make these drought conditions or dry conditions even worse when you have that kind of erosion showing up on those hilltops, especially if you're dealing with sandier or lighter soils.
Yep. Yeah. John and I, well, John and I tease each other back and forth and banter a lot of times, and it's always friendly banter and things like that. And John will say that the number one nutrient of concern is nitrogen, followed closely by phosphorus, and then of course K, S, and so forth. And I always bug him and say, no, the number one nutrient is water. It's dihydrogen monoxide, John. It's if you don't have water, if it's droughty, it doesn't matter how many nutrients you're going to have, and we're going to see that this fall with the soil test too on these arid and eroded areas. Is that if the crop didn't take up any nutrients, it's still going to be there, and because these are areas where they're low productivity, so low crop uptake, but they're also areas that unless you've got extreme erosion happening here, you're getting runoff rather than infiltration. So you're not getting leaching, you're not getting denitrification in these areas. Chances are those nutrients are going to still be there, and that's the good news story. The bad news story is, even if you can recover some of your yield potential by adding high rates of fertilizer on this, price of fertilizer right now is highly expensive. So to start recommending that, just double it in these areas where you're going to get the least return back in productivity, there's got to be a better way.
Absolutely. Do we need to send John Hurd back to school to learn about the Liebig's law of the minimum and how it's not just about nutrients? I see John comments.
So John his head will be exploding right now.
He's muted. Oh.
Well, the good news is you don't get to see my head here, but I think that that's one of those things. Those classic studies done back in the 80s showed that, moisture holding capacity really important, but you do have to admit that on the clay loam soils where they did these studies, soils that still had clay in them, providing they had water, yes, the nutrients did take account for a lot of the yield loss, or manure would have done the same. But I will admit that on those sandy soils without organic matter, nutrients aren't enough to close the gap. You need to have moisture holding capacity. So.
And when students complain about having to spend so much time learning about texture, soil texture, and how boring that might be, these are some of the reasons why learning about soil texture and understanding the texture that you're dealing with in your soil can be so important. Okay, in a situation where tillage would be necessary, would you rather till in the fall so that you're direct seeding in the spring without drying up the soil before it goes in the ground, or till before the drill?
That's a good question. That depends. I'm sorry to say it that way, but I would say it depends based on what is your drill specs like. If you're set to go in the spring with needing very little tillage, you might be better off to till in the spring or defer it till the spring, and in case you need it, say for managing residue, flattening the seed bed, or controlling an early flush of weeds, if you want to use tillage to control weeds, to do it in the spring. If you do it in the fall and it's dry and you remove all that residue, so you're chopping it off, there's a few things there. You're reducing your residue cover. You're being dry, you're probably breaking up clods and that, so you're going to have things more prone to erosion, particularly by wind over the winter, and that's where we get that phenomenon called snert, the snow and the black colored snow ending up in the ditches. And the thing you haven't shown yet, Marla, that you could, or you probably have the link to it, is the whole thing about tillage and how it affects infiltration. Is that a lot of people think that tillage is going to open up the soil and increase infiltration, and there may be instances where it does, but it's probably more the exception than the rule, like under compacted soils. Mm-hmm. And you can touch on that. You should show the YouTube video at some point, or give the link about the problem when tillage cutting off the cracks in the root channels, and how that actually really cuts off and short circuits any potential boost in infiltration, because those openings now are no longer connected right to the surface.
Yeah, and there's another question that had come in here too about, you know, people say in the Red River Valley area feeling the need to open up the field to accept more moisture. And is this the way to think, that you have to till to allow more water to move into the soil? And yeah.
First thing, and I haven't been out there, so I'm not saying this to be facetious. So I'm saying check and see how many and how big your cracks are in some of those heavy soils in the Red River Valley.
Yeah, and we were talking about this yesterday, the idea of that preferential flow, right? And where the water is moving, and sometimes bypassing some of the root zone if you've got these deep cracks. But at the same time, if in the valley where we've got a soil that accepts water very slowly and is very deep with clay, I guess the question then is preferential flow a bad thing if it's also moving water a bit deeper in the profile faster on a clay soil, because of the fact that the clay soils otherwise are just going to have water ponding on the surface? So, but that is not tilling the soil to open it up to accept more moisture. That is that soil being dry enough and cracked open to a very deep depth to allow water to flow kind of essentially past the root zone, but start to build up that water table again. But is it going to be better if you've got a tilled soil that's fluffy and maybe accepts soil in the or accepts more water in the top 4 to 6 inches, and then it stops flowing down?
My gut on this would be going back to that first principle I tried to say, you know, and again, it's a principle. It's not a rule that's right all the time. It's not the law of gravity necessarily, but do whatever you can to increase the infiltration and minimize your runoff.
Mm-hmm.
And the bypass flow, or we called it macropore flow or whatever, in that, yeah, you may not be getting it going into the actual soil matrix so much, but at least it's going into the soil. It's going in and it's wetting up the soil at some point. And we know on these clay soils, they'll only wet up for so long, and then they're going to start to swell, and those cracks are going to shut off. So you're going to get very fast flow into these soils for the short term, but once they start wetting up, it's gonna drop. And that's an infiltration concept too. Is that, you know, it's kind of I'm going to draw this backwards, but infiltration rates into dry soil start off very high, and then they drop over time to kind of a constant or a saturated level. So that's usually what we're measuring, is the true movement of water in the soils once they're saturated. But what people are dealing with early on is how fast can we get water moving in when things are dry? And the answer is, even on these clays, if they're cracked, it's very fast at the start.
And further to that, like we all, I think we, and anyway on the panel, fully understand the benefit of soil structure and the fact that a well-structured soil is actually going to benefit in terms of having a so if you've got a well-structured soil with a mix of aggregate sizes, you then have a mix of pore sizes that come along with that, right? You've got small aggregates, more small pores, you've got bigger aggregates with bigger kind of pores, and you have the ability for air and water to move through that soil differently. So building aggregation is the thing that helps to kind of add on to the benefits, or maybe the side effects that come along with the structure or the texture, sorry, that you are kind of given to work with. So anything that we can do to build structure in a clay soil will essentially help to move those rains down into the soil profile. And we don't build structure by tilling, and that's just a reality. And it also comes down then to what kind of equipment you're using to conduct the tillage. So if you are going in and using like a chisel plow, something that kind of separates and breaks up aggregates more on their natural plane versus a disc that is essentially pulverizing soil, there's a difference then between two types of tillage implements and what that does to soil structure. And so it's another thing to keep in mind, that if you want to maintain or build structure, even within a tillage system, discs are really hard on structure.
biggest thing on a lot of this is again trying to go back to the principles on this. You know, is you want to build. If you want to improve your soil structure, you need to eliminate the tillage, ideally, or at least minimize it, and you want to build soil organic matter.
Mm-hmm.
You want to add or conserve soil organic matter in any way possible with crop residues, manure, moving around topsoil is one option there as well. And again, you know, that's a rule of thumb to incent people and saying like a 1% increase in soil organic matter can increase crop productivity quite substantially. But don't get too excited about, oh, it's just 1% of soil organic matter. That's hard to do. That's a lot of work. It takes some time unless you're transferring topsoil from place to place.
Mm-hmm. That is the immediate return that you get by moving your topsoil around. Since we're talking structure, I just have to bring this up because somebody posted this as a question somewhat sarcastically. They said, I see you didn't mention adding calcium containing products for salinity management. This is talking about yesterday a little bit, and had to throw that out there because calcium being one of the major cations that happen to be in our soils, and when we've got high lime soils, we've got a lot of calcium floating around in them. Calcium is a builder of soil structure. And so while calcium can help to build soil structure, where you're losing soil structure, we already generally have a lot of that calcium available. And so adding a little bit more is likely not going to do anything. The only time that the addition of calcium can help is if you have really high sodium levels in your soil. But that's high sodium in relation to calcium. So if you think you've got a sodium problem, give me a call and we can talk through that. But generally speaking, unless you have a soil that has a very high sodium absorption ratio or too much calcium or too much sodium, in relation to calcium magnesium, that's the only time that you're going to have a benefit really from adding a calcium product. Otherwise, our soils in Manitoba that are full of calcium happen to have the ability to build good soil structure because calcium is one of those cations that helps to flocculate clays and build structure in clays. So I had to just bring that up.
No, I was gonna, you'll get me braver as I get talking here throughout the morning, and I'll get more outlandish in my comments, see if I really get John going on stuff here. But tillage, if you need to do it, think about how you're doing it. I'm not judging. I'm not trying to make it all black and white or anything like that. But if you can eliminate it, that's probably a really good thing. There's probably two exceptions of where you'd want to consider tillage this fall. One might be subsoiling your compacted zones. Now that it's dry, you'll get some shattering, and you can speak more to that, Marla. And the other one would be if we need to manage some weeds, especially if we're concerned about herbicide resistance. That's for Kim to consider there too and comment on as well.
Yeah, I would bring Kim into the discussion. There, okay, I see she's unmuted. Hi, Kim. And so this is one of those things that we do need to think about in terms of how to manage some of these fall weeds and also these volunteer crops that we've got coming up right now and some of the regrowth happening. I know you're going to be touching on this tomorrow, but do you have comments around how do we make this decision considering all of these factors?
Well, I think guys have heard me say earlier this year on the crop talks and stuff, I know I'm supposed to be telling you to not bother spraying your annual weeds or not bother spraying your annual crops because winter's going to kill them. But I'm a big fan of spraying this fall when possible, just because those crops and those weeds are using up valuable moisture. They're also taking up a fair bit of nutrients, which will end up being recycled. But when you'll get those back, that's a matter of debate. But you will get most of those nutrients back again, but that moisture you're not going to get back. There are situations where I definitely wouldn't kill. And I think, Marla, you and I talked about this not very long ago, so your kochia patches. I would not be doing tillage on my kochia patches because those are saline patches. And I would not, that's the worst thing I think you could be doing to manage your kochia. I'd rather be mowing it off, baling it, burning it, doing something to get rid of that. I would be spraying in all cases where I could, just to try to manage those weeds, stop any further seed set. And then just kind of maintain the integrity of that of that field for the spring. And if you have to do a tillage, then like Curtis just said, save it for the spring and do it then if you have to. I just don't want to see us drying out our soils any more than we have to right now.
Yeah, I agree. And even the discussion too, Kim, about like saving it for the spring if you can. And this is always the conundrum, especially in the valley. The idea that, well, if we're wet, because so often we are dealing with wetter falls and on those sticky clays, getting on the field before seeding leaves a lot of messes and usually isn't a great thing to do. So we have this idea that we have to go on and get that tillage done in the fall. And that we don't know what spring is going to bring. And so the idea of going on and getting a perfect seed bed created in the fall means that when we're dealing with the dry conditions in the spring that we have been seeing for the past few years, we do see an increase in soil movement off of those fields. Whether or not that is a huge economic loss in that field, we also have been seeing other issues that come along with that soil movement beyond just seeing it blow across the road and into somebody else's field potentially, or into the ditches and filling those up, and then the ditches have to be cleaned out, but also the sandblasting effect that we've been seeing on crops. So we've had problems with canola being reseeded because of sandblasting being so bad. We have seen issues with corn being sandblasted, but that with this corn, it might not actually decrease yield potential. You end up getting this, gray kind of coloring and effect on the leaves, and the crop will most likely grow out of it, may leave you at a somewhat higher risk of things like Goss's wilt or other diseases, but that is something else to kind of consider. So if you don't want to worry about whether or not the soil is leaving your field, you do want to worry about, if you've got those sandier soils that are prone to blowing, the damage it can actually do on those growing crops in the early season.
Can you see that slide, Marla?
Yep.
Okay, there, good.
Comment just came in. There's a lot of assumptions that there's going to be moisture in spring, and on sands it's a lot worse to lose that moisture in the spring when we need to germinate a crop. And I think that's a good point. It's hard to make that, like, to always run on the assumption that we're going to have next spring. And I think we need to maybe start thinking about running on the assumption that what we lose this fall, especially if we're thinking about tillage to control weeds or manage the seed bed, whatever it is we're trying to do, we've got potential loss. And so we do need to think more about protecting and preserving, because while we could have a wet spring, remember yesterday we were talking about how far behind we are in terms of soil moisture and growing a crop, and we're essentially a full year behind in precipitation, which means we're a full crop behind in terms of available moisture. And that is a scary position to be in. So every single thing that we can do to help move what moisture we get into the soil profile, I think we need to be looking at taking that. It's really about getting that water into the soil and having that storage build back up again.
Yep, and it's reconstructing the sponge, so to speak. So like building your organic matter, improving your structure. It's kind of a hard thing in some ways to do this, because we're saying do this by not doing something else.
Yeah.
And tillage is often one of these things. I don't know the psychology behind it, but I do it and I've enjoyed it when I've done it. Is that you're out and you're doing something.
Exactly. But
sometimes that's not the best thing to be doing. Sometimes it's better to leave it as is, and a lot of things that get recommended now is based on the philosophy, go back to doing what replicating what happens in nature. So having that cover, having standing stubble to trap snow, it may make a difference, it may not make much of a difference, but chances are this year it would make a difference. Again, depends how much snow we get and all that, but if you can trap it and keep it where you need it, we know the soil's dry, we know that it'll soak in if there's infiltration, ability for it to infiltrate, but you got to set it up so that it can, rather than just blow off.
Yeah, and that is part of the issue too, is the things that we're talking about, moving towards less tillage, building organic matter, building structure. These are not quick fixes. These are not something that you're going to snap your fingers and have water infiltrate so perfectly next spring when we get that rainfall. These are long-term decisions.
But
And
the only exception is that, if we tout the landscape restoration and you want to move topsoil, well, you could be doing that by say cleaning out some of your pre-existing drainages right now, so that if it does turn wet, at least that's been done, and it's been done in a way that you've minimized compaction as opposed to doing that on a wet fall.
yeah,
And you're putting topsoil on these areas that need it the most, because
yeah, it is.
they're not if you have no topsoil left on these areas, it's very hard to get it productive. You can if you're adding water, or if you got lots of water, but that's the problem that we're faced with right now, is a lack of water.
Yeah.
Curtis,
So
that means you would recommend that farmers back their tractor up to the scraper rather than the deep tiller this fall.
Yes. Couldn't have said it better myself, John.
it's a better use of time if you have that ability to be spending some time and you're looking for something to do. And the scariest words, as I've mentioned before, are when farmers call and say, well, but Marla, I have time. You've got this open fall, I've got time, so can't I till? And time can be a detriment in this case, because that also means you don't want to sit around twiddling your thumbs. So I always say it's better to spend that time fishing. Yeah, thanks. Somebody else posted that. Go fishing. Exactly. Go spend some time fishing. If you want to,
or you can do some reading. Reading, right, Marla? And John?
If you want to spend money or invest your money in something that's more beneficial for you, for your mental health, than going out, getting out and spending some time tilling, instead of spending money on the fuel, go buy a boat. And that seems like it's probably going to be a better use of your dollars at that point, for the long term, for the long haul anyway. I want to talk though a little bit about how do we deal with some of these residue problems, because this is a lot of the reason why people are bringing back this concept or discussion on tillage. Or, I mean, we're always dealing with residue, and that's why we get so focused on it. We may have less residue in places this year just because of lesser crop growth, because it was so dry, and that could actually be a benefit to us, so that in the valley where we're usually dealing with lots and lots of residue, that some of that might be cut back a little bit if we've got if we had less biomass accumulated in the crop. But one of the crops where we can see a bit more potential for issue is soybeans, because a lot of the harvest is being done where the vine has been greener and the straw is a bit more tough. And soybean stubble is one of those tough stubbles to deal with anyway. I have jokingly asked, when I speak a little bit, when we talk about vertical tillage and other ways to manage soybeans, I often will jokingly ask in a group of farmers, have you ever tried to harrow soybeans? And that's when everybody just gives me the death stare, because everybody's response is, yeah, once. I tried it once and then never again. And that's because it gets tied up in the harrows and it's just a mess. It doesn't flow properly. It's a really tough stubble to deal with. So what do we need to do in order to deal with that stubble? Also related to this too, since, I mean, not that we would be heavy harrowing that stubble. Someone else has asked, do you consider the heavy harrow to be an active tillage or a tillage implement? So the reason why I bring this up then is because a lot of times the vertical till unit ends up being used to chop and size residue and deal with these residue issues. And the vertical till unit, when they're not very aggressive, and the true vertical till units that go straight through, have a straight coulter or those waved coulters that are not on an angle, they are essentially designed to cut and size, chop residue down into smaller sizes so that it can flow through the seeder next year. That is a useful piece of equipment for residue management. I never want to speak about vertical tillage as a useful piece of tool or a useful piece of equipment for soil management. I try to focus it on residue when they are those true vertical till units for residue managers. When we get a lot of throwing of soil with the high-speed shallow discs and we move away from vertical and we start moving to the angle, that's where we pulverize and break up the soil. So while they can chop up and size that residue, They also leave a beautiful seed bed. Everybody loves the vertical till unit because it fluffs everything up and leaves it nice and smooth on the surface. And it leaves a nice pack down, 2 inches. So you've got something firm to place the seed into. And the problem is that we're starting to see this potential for compaction showing up at 2 inches where we're over-tilling or overusing this type of equipment, and only ever fluffing up that top 2 inches and then firming everything below it. So something to keep in mind, they can be very useful for helping with that residue management, but if they are throwing a lot of soil and pulverizing a lot of soil, then that is not a situation you want to be in. So if you are dealing with that soybean stubble, low disturbance vertical till could be one way to deal with it.
I was going to say a couple points there on that. Again, when we're trying to trap snow for moisture and to minimize erosion risk, the rules of thumb there is standing stubble is always better than flat stubble. So you want that, and if you're trying to minimize erosion too, surface roughness is a factor to have there. It's nice to have things ready to go for spring, but a nice smooth flat seed bed that's got little cover on it over the winter is one of the worst things you can have.
Exactly.
You want to make dirt. That's how to do it.
Someone just.
It's John here. Maybe I missed this commandment that thou shalt harrow all your crops in the fall, because I think that we have people to look back. What's the reason I harrow? Is it because of inadequacy of the back end of my combine? Am I not chopping? Am I not spreading chaff? And I know it's a tried and true Western farmer tradition to harrow. It makes sense to germinate seeds of cereals, maybe canola, but I never saw where it fit with soybeans. Soybeans were never grown in harrow country before. So it's only Western farmers that have this yearn to harrow and then plug them up with soybeans. Just leave the darn thing sitting there. Make sure you're spreading it the same width and drive on next spring. So I find it's a mix of Eastern crop and Western tradition that just doesn't work very good.
So adding to that too, I guess to build on that, it also, when you look at your tillage management and when people are looking at cutting back, first of all, yes, making sure the number one thing that you want to do in the fall, well, you're getting the combine ready and everybody's worried about all sorts of settings on the combine. I'm worried about whether or not that straw chopper, those knives are sharp and everything is actually chopping and spreading appropriately. That is something we need to remember to be focused on, because that is going to be your first step in managing that residue, getting good chop and good spread. But the other thing is, when we talk about the use of what you're seeding into, what kind of seeder or planter do you have? And if we're dealing with most people having more kind of seeders now that are appropriate for planting into a no-till situation or appropriate for planting into stubble, then we're already set up for a bit of success in that way. So also be thinking about what kind of seeder you have, because I've had people who have told me in the past, well, zero till is easy. Why aren't more farmers doing it? All you do is stop tilling. And I think, it's so much more complicated than that, because it's a whole system. It's not just an action or an activity. But one of the big things about that system is making sure that you've got an appropriate seeder. I do want to bring up a comment that had come in here about whether seeding is considered a form of tillage, which it can be, specifically looking at high disturbance seeders that can move a lot of soil and blacken the land. So when we are dealing with some of these, like the earlier no-till seeders and things that were coming out, they did move a lot of soil. And so as an act of seeding, that can also be a form of tillage.
Yeah, I think we took a crack at this. You're delaying there. We took a crack at this in the soil management guide a number of years ago about trying to define the relationships. Like, what's the difference between direct seeding versus no-till? Well, or minimum till on some of this, and it comes down to disturbance created at seeding. and whether or not there's any pre-tillage before seeding too. So direct seeding is a form of no-till, but it usually means it's a seeder with sweeps or something that's got fairly high disturbance on it that's essentially blackening the soil after you're done, whereas the truest sense of no-till is you're going in with something that's very minimal disturbance, probably a disc or at least a very narrow knife, and leaving most of the, if not all of the stubble still upright, and creating as little disturbance as possible.
Mm-hmm.
That's not to say direct seeding can't work or anything like that, but again, you know, this needs to be a conscious decision. It's like, well, if that's what you want to do, if that's, you want to kill weeds at seeding with tillage, or you want to reduce the amount of cover you've got, you know, you got to weigh the pros and the cons. And if that's not what you want to do, well, the good news is you've got the rest of the fall and the winter to see if you need to make any modifications to your drill. Do you need to change the openers? Do you need to change something to you know, move from the conditions we've been used to the last number of years to now dealing with more dry conditions?
And this brings up when I often talk about strategic tillage. So the idea of using some strategy and when tillage is the most appropriate in your crop rotation, not just in the climate or the you know, moisture changes and fluctuations we see, that also builds into it. But the idea of, if you need to till to manage certain residues, let's say, or to prepare a seedbed for a certain crop that you are planting the next year, how do you strategically decide what level of tillage is required from year to year within that crop rotation? So if you've got this planned crop rotation, you have the ability to kind of plan some of that tillage as well in terms of what's required to, again, manage the residue from one crop and manage the seedbed for the crop that's coming in. And doing that allows for also thinking beyond the whole one tool for all the jobs, which is the reason why I bring up things like high-speed discs, is that once people were investing in buying this piece of equipment, it makes this beautiful seedbed. The problem is we see this used over and over and over on every piece of land, sometimes 2 passes in the fall. And it's really starting to set our soils up for that wind erosion loss and set our soils up for just having been essentially pulverized again at the surface, getting that new plow layer starting to show up at 2 inches. So if we think about strategic tillage, we're also thinking about how the different implements we have can fit into where they need to be to achieve what we're trying to do with the crops that we're growing, within the crops we're growing. So periodic tillage might not be a bad thing in those systems, but that also allows for periodic rest, let's say, where you also can kind of schedule in where you're going to let the soil rest, or to put in more of that no-till or low-till opportunity.
Amen. I think we don't do enough periodic tillage. I have environmental friends that are all bent out of shape because I've got high phosphorus in the top 2 inches, and they're, oh, woe is me. They're struggling to know what to do. Duh, you bury it. So, but that is like sacrilege to say that to a zero tiller. But many people are thinking this. Curtis, you know of research that Dave Lobb's been doing, and he found that was a solution, right?
I think so. I have to look and see which specific one it was. You probably already know it, and you're just putting me on the spot. But yes, that's the kind of that we need to do.
I just want you to agree with me for once. But anyways, yes, you know, if there are several problems that sometimes we just need steel and diesel fuel to fix. And like ruts in the fall, you fix them. And I think periodic tillage is vilified, but it needs to be strategically adopted. And so you do it to get the bad weeds, you do it to fill ruts, you do it to bury the high phosphorus, and you just pick your battles. And if you're worried about it in the fall, well, maybe that's one reason why you might want to cover crop. You do that after your tillage and then get your system started again.
Yeah, the project that John, you're referring to, first of all, they were finding that by adopting no-till was increasing soluble phosphorus coming off or dissolved phosphorus coming off the field, because it kind of puts to bed some of the ideas that in Manitoba we follow the same as you would see in the southern US, where all phosphorus moves with soil particles. So stopping erosion through like soil erosion through zero tillage doesn't decrease or eliminate. It actually sometimes increases or can increase the potential for phosphorus loss. It did decrease nitrogen losses from the field, however. But then when they went to this idea of rotational tillage, so tilling every once in a while, after that tillage year, it would decrease that potential phosphorus loss. And so again, and it would come up again as they go back into no-till. So it flows a little bit, for lack of a better term, as it kind of rotates through with the up and downs of the till, no-till within the system. But there is some benefits to burying some of that phosphorus that's built up on the surface.
Go ahead.
No, you go ahead, Curtis.
I was just going to say, like I say, tillage is you know, as a values, it's value neutral. Like, it's not bad if you do it. It's not necessarily good if you don't. But you need to be conscious of the decision of what you're doing before you hook on and just go do something.
Exactly. Okay. How often would you till to move in immobile nutrients? Is this once every 5 years, 10 years, or is it based on the crop rotation across the farm? So if you were trying to then bury some of those immobile nutrients in the soil, how often would you expect to do that tillage?
Maybe I just mentioned that this is under construction as far as any decision like that. But in a little bit of the sampling that I've done at you know, some good farmers, we find compared to the 0 to 6 inch sampling depth that may find phosphorus at 10 part per million. If you look at the top 2 inches, it tends to be about double that concentration, so maybe 20 part per million. So it's a case where I don't know, we can wait, and there are some departments, they're going to establish the red lights for us as far as what's tolerable to have at the surface, and it may well be something like that that triggers our decision when it's time to mix or bury or dilute those nutrients versus have them continue to build at surface.
Mm-hmm. So other comments that have been coming up around this idea of mixing or even using the, like going back to the idea of the heavy Harrow isn't it useful for burning off the straw? Essentially, the microbes are breaking it down as an alternative to actually burning, right? And so the idea of the use of a Harrow or something to spread out and break down some of that straw as opposed to lighting a match to get rid of it. Comments from anybody on that one?
Yeah, I agree. I was waiting for someone to come back and defend the Harrow. And yes, that's what I would see it doing, is you create soil to straw contact. Mm-hmm. And because if the straw is sitting up high and dry, it's kind of not going to decompose. You mix it with the soil, you put it down the soil, and then you're going to get some fall degradation.
So on that topic of straw, in this case now, someone has posted about going back to this idea of residue management. They're dropping straw for livestock and they're dealing with windrows. Is there any advice? Said there's a lot of others in the boat this year, I guess, after that straw, because again, when we bale up that straw, we're not baling up 100% of that residue, and there's a lot that's kind of left behind in those windrows. Any advice or discussion around that idea of when we're dropping that straw and dealing with windrows after the fact?
You're dropping it and it's getting baled up?
Yeah, but I'm guessing that there's still some chaff and such that's left behind, so you're going to end up seeing those like the kind of remainder that doesn't get picked up by the baler.
Yeah, you might get some rows of chaff showing up like that. Like some now they still use the chaff spreader when you're dropping the straw, but in some cases maybe not. And there could be something there, but it's probably better to let Kim take that one on that. I'd say, you know, you're removing a lot of straw there. Keep the rest of it upright and don't till it, and keep it to make the most of what's left over after the other's been baled off.
John here, I'd just say that those chaff rows, that's where I see yellow crop the following year. We just tend to get a bunch more nitrogen immobilization if we've got confined chaff rows. And, you know, in this part of the row, even the soybeans turn yellow in the spring because they need nitrogen early in the season to establish. And yeah, poorly spread chaff rows, we can see them next spring too.
Mm-hmm. Another comment had come in from Byron saying that the decomposition of the straw when it's this dry is probably not going to be that active anyway. And when we don't have surface moisture, soil moisture, in order to help decompose that straw, we're not going to have that microbial activity. So we've got the heat potentially, but we don't have the moisture for those microbes. And so that's going to slow down or kind of eliminate some of that microbial breakdown of the straw anyway. There's two questions that that are still left in our question box here that I want to get through. And I know we're almost out of time, so I apologize for anybody who's still hanging on and ready to get on with their day. Both of them come back to the idea of tillage. One is about the subsoiling, and I know that Curtis had brought this up earlier about the idea of subsoiling and using that for compaction or salinity. So the idea of subsoiling or breaking up that soil to open it up deeper and try to break up some of that compaction. If you are trying to subsoil, you want to be doing it when it is dry to depth. And so this would be the kind of year when subsoiling may be effective because the subsoiler needs to shatter and break up that pan, and it needs dry conditions to do that. So when it's wet, you just cause all sorts of smearing and problems. But when it's dry, you can potentially have that subsoiling activity work. That being said, if you're dealing with heavier soils, first of all, it's a lot of horsepower to drag that thing through heavy clays when it's that dry as well. And then our clays are already cracking open naturally. And so if you're dealing with soils that have cracks in them, Mother Nature's already subsoiled them for you. So it might not actually be that additionally effective to go in and attempt to subsoil. Sandy soil is a little bit different if they don't have those clays that kind of crack and swell or shrink and swell to open those cracks up. Salinity, just we'll touch on that and just say that, sure, the idea of opening up those saline areas to allow water to move back down seems great on paper, but sometimes it'll actually open things up to allow water to move up. And so you can end up causing a bigger salinity problem when trying to subsoil saline areas. I've seen it go both ways, and I can't tell you which way it's going to go. So that's a roll of the dice there if I ever did see one. And so keep that in mind. Upward movement is not what you want to encourage, and so that can happen as well. Last question to kind of wrap things up, which we've kind of got into a little bit with regards to tillage, but I think just thinking back to management of tillage in general in any fall, not just wet or not just dry falls. If we're dealing with a cool or moist fall, as opposed to this fall where we're hot and dry, would tillage be less destructive on soil organic matter if we were tilling in a cool, moist fall compared to right now when it's warm and dry?
My gut would say probably yes, but you're still tilling it and you're still causing oxidation of organic matter, which is, if we're going to talk soil health at some point later, soil organic matter is your #1 indicator.
Yeah. And I'm going to add to that, for me, that structure potential. We've got more potential for a lot of smearing, maybe if it's cool and wet or cool and moist. So potential for more compaction to happen because we're traveling over the field when we're in a higher risk for compaction, and potentially, again, smearing things up and causing more soil structural damage. When we talk about soil microbes and the importance of being able to provide, good microbiology in the soil, the #1 thing we also need to think about is providing a good home for those microbes in the soil, ones where they have adequate air and water. And that comes along with building good soil structure. And so the idea of tilling when it is cool and moist may actually be more detrimental to soil structure than when it's kind of warm and dry like right now. Any last comments from our panelists?
I think people got to get back to their day. So
exactly,
yep.
I know. So hearing none, thank you again for joining us today. We appreciate the time that you guys are spending with us this week. Really appreciate the questions coming in. This has been fantastic. Join us tomorrow at 8:30 in the morning because Kim is going to be joining us for Weeds Wednesday, where we're going to talk about weed control, herbicide carryover, all those fun extra things that we need to think about when it comes to soil management this fall. So thanks again today, and we will see you guys tomorrow.